In the previous video, we've completed our login controller, and in this one, we are going to have a look at the register controller. Now, before we do this, let's just go back to our login controller because I've forgotten to do a few things here. As you can see, this constructor, it's supposed to return null or response, but we don't actually return anything. So let's proceed this call to the redirect if logged in with the return statement. And then if we scroll down, you'll see that this JSON response here, when we actually click on this get content, you'll see it actually returns string. So if we go back here and change this JSON, return JSON response to simply string, that should also remove this highlighting of the code. And I think that's everything. Everything else seems to be fine. So we can now save and close our login controller. Let's open the file browser and let's create a new controller. This time we are going to call it register controller, and it is within the same namespace, which is this app controllers. It will also extend the main controller. There we go, app controller, and we are going to start with the protected rules property, and registration form will have the following fields: name, which will be required. Then we are going to have email field, which will also be required, but it also needs to validate as an email. Then we are going to have password, which will be required, but it will also need to have the confirmation field, so confirmed. And then the password confirmation, which simply needs to be required. Now, this confirmed, as you may remember, will check if the field with the same name and appended underscore confirmation exists within the request, and values of both are equal. Okay, let's add some doc block here. This is an array, and if we now add a protected function constructor, which will override, it will also return this redirect if logged in, because we don't want anyone to be able to access registration form when they are already logged in to the system. And let's add some doc block again. It returns response. Let's import this response and then add to parent constructor. When I said import, obviously if you don't use PHP Storm and don't have this macro which imports classes automatically, make sure that you add this use statement with Symfony component HTTP foundation response above the class definition. Okay, so the next method will be our index one, so public function index, and this one will simply return this view, and it's going to be pages register. And let's also add some doc block here. It returns view, so let's import it. We can remove this factor. Let's just keep as view, and again importing Illuminate view. And let's add some doc block display registration form. Okay, if we now save it and preview everything in a browser, and if we click on the register link, you'll see it takes us to the register path, and that loads this register controller, which now displays the view. And let's have a look at the view file as well. So if we go to our resources, views, and then page, and we have this register one, you'll see we're going to be posting to this register controller to the post method using the post method. And if we scroll down, we have this heading. Obviously, feel free to amend all these options as you wish. Obviously, keep the fields because we're gonna need them. And then the validation here for required, and if the registration fails for any reason, there we go. We've got name, we've got email, which is of the email type. Same validation rules here, so required and email. Then we have password, which needs to be confirmed. So we have this password confirmation field. And then we have just a button, and that's it. So that's our registration form. If we go back to the register controller, let's now create this post method that will process the submitted request. I'm just going to create a few new lines here. Okay, so we start with the public function post. And we are going to start with this post request only, because we only want to allow post method when we submit in the form. We don't want to allow the get method. And what I mean by this, once again, is post is when our form, if we scroll up, uses the post method. Otherwise, method could be get, but we obviously want to send everything with the post. We don't want to reveal all this information that we send in the URL, which is what would happen if we used get method. Okay, so I'm just going to close the file browser on the left. So now we're going to wrap the remaining part of this method within the try and catch block. And catch will catch just a standard exception represented with the e variable, and let's import this exception here as well. So import class, and again scroll up is just use exception. And we are going to start with the try block. First of all, we are going to collect the request, so this collect request, and the items we are interested in are name, then email, then password, then password confirmation. So these are the items that we want to collect. Once we've collected them, let's validate the request. So this validate request. So now we know that all these items are valid. Then we are also going to validate email. And this method, we don't have it yet, will basically check if the submitted email address is already in a database, basically, if the record for this email already exists. So if we just quickly add this method, and within this method we first try and obtain the user instance by calling user, and it's going to be app models, and then method by email. We pass this input and we get item email from this request, and then we want to get first record. So first item. If we find record of the user by submitted email address, that means that this user already exists, and we obviously need to return some validation message back to the client. So we're going to check if is not is null, which would indicate that obviously this is a valid instance of the user model, meaning that we found the user. So user, there we go. If it's not null, then we are going to add this, add error, and we're going to add error for the email field, and the validation message that we want to trigger is going to be taken. And now to terminate the execution of the remaining code within this try block, we need to also throw the exception. Throw new exception, and we're going to say email address already in use. So that's validate email done. Let's just quickly add some dog blocks here. It throws exception and returns void, so return void. And for the summary, let's just say check if email is already taken, or perhaps email address is already taken. Okay, so if we pass this line, then that means that our request, all of these fields validate that we don't have this email address within the database yet. So what we need to do next is remove this password confirmation, because we're not going to be adding this to the database. So input, and on this input, because it's a collection, Illuminate collection, we can use the method called offset unset in order to remove the given index, and our index name is password underscore confirmation. This is what we want to remove from this collection. And the next thing we're going to do is return this add user method. We don't have this user, and we will provide the implementation for this method in just a moment. I'm just going to add method stub here, just an empty method. But before we do anything else, I'm going to return from within the catch block new JSON response, this Illuminate HTTP JSON response. And for this response, I'm going to put in first item this errors, which will basically send all of the errors in the JSON format, and then response, and then unprocessable entity, this HTTP underscore unprocessable underscore entity, which is 422 status code. Okay, and semicolon at the end, and that's our post method completed. So let's quickly add some dog blocks here as well. We are going to say that it returns rather than response it returns string, and it doesn't return void. It returns string only, because void would return from this email, validate email, but because we throw exception, it would go to this catch block, and obviously we still return this JSON response. So we only return string. Okay, and then what we're going to say here, process request. I think that says it all. Okay, if we now scroll down to our add user method, from within add user, we are going to first check if we can create the user, and we will instantiate this user at the same time. So we check if, and within the brackets, exclamation mark, then we are creating the variable user equals, and then user create, and we pass the attributes, which is going to be this input to array, because we need array. By default, this input is of a collection instance, but if we run this method to array, it will return all these collected items in the array format, so we can pass them onto this create method on the user instance. And when we create the new user instance, which we've just created, will also be returned, so we can associate it with the variable here. And if it doesn't, if we weren't able to create it, then what we do, and I'm just going to create 2 new lines, I'm going to add these lines here as well and copy what I've got within this validate email. And this time what we're going to return the error for the name field, because it's a first field, and this is where I want this validation method to be displayed. It's failed. If we now just go back to our register blade, you'll see we have this failed item here, so record could not be added. If it couldn't be added for any reason, then this message will be displayed on this above this name field. Okay, and obviously the message for the exception, what we can say, could not add new user record. And I think that's it for this exception. Now, if this method fails, then we will have instance of the user associated with this variable. So we will be able to use this user after this if statement. So we then check if .env is, and then we check verification variable. If we just open our browser, and if we open our env file, you remember we have this verification, which is basically Boolean, which represents Boolean true or false. So it tells us whether we want to verify user by sending them activation email first or not. So we are going to check if this verification is set to true. Then we are going to return this activation, and we pass user as argument. Let's now add this method stub. We're not going to be working on this method yet. Let's type hint it as well. It's going to be user model. User model is what we inject into this method. So after this check here, we are going for this guard, and we are going to log in this user. We pass user as argument. As you may remember, our guard class has this login method. We pass the user, and then remember token as well, whether we want to remember the user or not. But in our case, because we register user rather than user being logged in on its own, we don't want to provide any token because we simply don't have it. So we won't be passing second argument to this login method here. Okay, and after this, what we need to do is return in between the brackets new JSON response, and the constructor for this class takes array as the first argument, which is going to be redirect. We want to redirect the user once we've logged them in to the dashboard, and then we call send headers method, and lastly get content as well. So we return string from this method using this get content method. Let's just add some dog blocks because our add user method is now completed. It does not return void, so just a string. And then we're going for add new user. For the summary, let's just quickly look at the code again if we haven't missed anything. So let's just go through this code once more. So first of all, we check in if we've created the user. If we've created the user, then this user variable will store the instance of that new user. If we don't, then obviously we add a new error and we terminate the execution of this method, which if we go back, this add user will take us to this catch block when we're going to return the response with all the errors and 422, I think it was, yes, 422, this HTTP unprocessable entity for the status code. If this if condition failed, then that means that obviously we've created a user, we have now associated this instance of this user with this variable, so we can then pass it to the activation only when the verification variable in the .env file is set to true. And by default, we set it to true anyway. So this activation would be what's going to be called and obviously returned with this add user. Now, otherwise, if we're to set this verification to false, that means we don't want to send the activation email. Once the user hits submit, register basically button, the form gets submitted, we verified all the information, it's all good, added the record to the database. Let's log this user in and redirect them to the dashboard page. Now, this activation method will be used with two different calls. First call will be made from within this add user method, which is what we typed here just a moment ago. And the second use for this method is going to be if we open resources, views, pages, and then a login blade, you'll see that we have this validation message here for inactive, which says your account has not been activated. And then we have resent activation email. And then we have call to this register and then activation action method, which is this one here. So let's just change the visibility for this method to public. And what I'm also going to do is to, by default, set this argument here to null. So it might be an instance of the user or it might simply be null, because obviously when we call in this directly from within add user, we will have instance of a user, at which point this user will actually be an instance of that user class. However, when we are going to click on this register activation link, you can see we have this ID resent activation. Let's open resources, assets, JS and app.js, and I'm going to close this file browser so we can see things a little bit better. We have this resent activation email, which is later on called from within this init, and init is called obviously when the page loads. So what happens here? When we click the item with the ID resent activation, which is going to be this link here, then we trigger this function, this closure. We are getting the value from within the email field. So if we just go back to our login field, login file, you can see we have this ID email field here, which is basically when we're going to type our email address for the login. And then we are appending this email to our URL. So basically wherever we are sending, URL is basically trigger property href, and trigger is basically our button, this instance. So property href, so this is the URL. Then we are appending question mark, so we have a query string here with the email equals, and then obviously whatever has been typed into this email field. And then we send it obviously to this activation method. So let's quickly, I'm just going to close all these files because we don't need them anymore. So from within this activation method, what we are going to do, we are going to wrap everything within, again, try and catch block, and we're going to catch exception as E, and we deal with this catch block a little bit later on. Let's first focus on actually getting the instance of the user. So we check if is null user. This would indicate that this call has been made when we actually clicked on this link from within the login screen. Okay, so we are trying to first of all find the user by this email address, which can be found within the query string. So user equals user by email, and then we get this request and get. We're trying to get email from this request, and then we want to get the first record that we can find by this email. There should be only one. Okay, and then we check if it's still null, is null user, then this would indicate that we don't have this record at all. So what we're going to do is, again, this add error, we're going to add email and then invalid, and we throw new exception with the message invalid email address. Okay, so let me just go through this once again. So we're checking if we pass through a valid instance of the user, then this condition will return false. So obviously this line will be ignored. Otherwise, if we click on this link, which contains the email address within the URL, so if we just go back to the file we had opened before this login, so it would be register activation, then question mark email, and that would equal whatever we've typed into this login email field. That would indicate that obviously we can get this email from the query string. This is when we're getting this from the request using this get method, and we indicate which query item we want to get the value of. And then we check whether we can find this user by this email. If we couldn't, if this call here still returns null, so obviously this variable would be null, then we add two errors and we throw the exception. If we pass this line, that means that we have a valid instance of the user associated with the variable. So the next thing we are going to do is if exclamation mark this send activation email method, we don't have it yet, and we pass user as an argument. If we couldn't send it, then again, we are going to add two errors and throw the exception. So I'm just going to copy this. And we are going to display this above the email field again. And the message we want to display is going to be technical. And if we just go back to our login blade, you'll see we have this data case here, this validation method for this technical index, and it simply says technical problem. If for any reason we couldn't send the email, then obviously that's the message we are going to display it. And for the exception, let's just say email could not be sent. Okay, let's add this send activation email method stub. We will work with this method a little bit later on. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to do is to create the variable called message, which is going to contain the message that I wanted to display after the form has faded out, and then obviously indicating that the message the email has been sent and what to do next. So please check your email for instructions on how to activate your account, and full stop. And after this, let's just return again within the brackets new JSON response, and then we're gonna call method send headers and then get content. And for the constructor of this JSON response, we are going to pass our message, so message and then message. Now we're not passing the second argument after this array for the JSON response constructor. If we click on this JSON response, you'll see the second argument is the status, which by default is 200. So we don't have to specify it if everything is okay. We're only going to specify this second argument, provide the second argument if there's some problem. Okay, so now for the exception, what we are going to do here for this catch block, we are going to also return new JSON response, and again we're going to send headers and get content, but this time for the first argument we are going to pass, actually rather than doing this array manually, we just put errors here, which is already of the array type, and then the second item, and I'm going to put both of these on new lines, is going to be status code, which is going to be response, and it's going to be unprocessable entity, indicating that something's wrong, something didn't validate quite right. Okay, so that's our activation method done. Let's just add some doc blocks, and what we are going to here, it returns string, it takes user instance or null, and then for the message we're going to say process activation email. And let's go through this method once again. So we're checking if the argument is null. If it's null, we're trying to obtain the record of the user by the email taken from the URL, from the query string. If we still cannot obtain it, if it's still null, then we simply add the error and throw the exception, which would take us directly to this catch block, and we would return basically all the errors in the JSON format together with the status code of 422 for this HTTP unprocessable entity. Let's just click on this once again. You can see it's associated with the 422 status code. Okay, then if all this passes, we have instance of the user, then we check if we cannot send activation email, and exactly same situation. If we cannot send it, then add to errors for the email field, technical problem, and then exception. Again, it takes us straight to the catch block. Otherwise, we prepare the message and then pass it through with the response, again in a JSON format, that message associated with the index message, so it can be displayed on the page. So that's it for this activation method. Now in the next video, we are going to start working on the send activation email method.